Hey guys, Dr. Mike Israel here for Renaissance Plus and RPU. Lecture number 5 in our Arguing to Convince course is about establishing common ground, which is our second extensive argument procedure. Today we'll talk about a couple of things. First of all, we'll talk about what establishing common ground really means. And it's a little bit more of an expansive definition than one might think just based on reading the terms. The next thing we're going to talk about is why we're even going about establishing common ground. It seems, if you tuned in for the last lecture, that we're doing a whole lot of sort of underlying background structural work before we even get into the disagreement itself. There's a very good reason to that. We're going to talk about it in this lecture. Then we're going to talk about 3 distinct kinds of establishing of common ground, termed understood perspectives, good points, and lastly, commonalities with views. So let's get right into it. When you establish common ground, you're actually getting into 3 different kinds of commentary on the opposing party's position in the debate. Here are the 3 different kinds. You take every single argument they have, every single sub-argument, every single point that they make, and you split them into 3 different categories of understanding. Category number 1, is when you admit what we call understood perspectives. The I see where you're coming from. We're going to talk about later that you don't agree with those perspectives at all, but you see where they're coming from, right? For example, we'll explain this in more depth later, but if an alien warship is floating up to Earth and you get a chance to talk to them, and they're like, we want to destroy Earth and kill all people to expand our empire. And you don't agree with that, of course. But you see where they're coming from because expanding empires makes sense, and to them, we're just aliens, and we probably look really weird and really scary, so they want to kill us all. It makes sense. Totally wrong, but we understand where they're coming from. That's for some of their points that you disagree with the most. The second category is called recognizing their good points. Some of the points they make, you'll be able to stamp with, okay, I recognize that that's a pretty good point. Now, you may still disagree with it either wholly or partially, but it is a pretty good point in the grand scheme, and you think there's at least some truth value or something to be learned there, right? The third is the points that you actually agree on, right? So recognizing where your views agree, and that should be most of the landscape. Remember, you're talking about the whole landscape of the discussion here, so you should have a lot of stuff where you mostly agree, some stuff where you just recognize they're good points, but they're just shy of being completely true, and still other understood perspectives where you go, I see where you're coming from, even though you don't agree with that perspective at all. Very different to see where someone's coming from versus agreeing that they should be coming from that position. All right. So that's what establishing common ground is, and in just a little bit we'll get into all 3 of those kinds of discussions and give examples of those. But why are we establishing common ground? Why can't we just get to the points of contention, right? Why can't we just get to the stuff we disagree on and really talk about it? It would save us a lot of time, and it really actually would at the front end. It'll save us no time total or at the back end because we're going to quagmire really fast for 2 reasons. Technical reasons and psychological reasons. Let's look at the technical ones first. Why are we establishing common ground? Reason number 1, it's so that we don't end up arguing over stuff we agree on. If you will go through a person's arguments and you say, okay, this is the stuff we definitely agree on, you just won't be talking about that stuff much or at all the rest of the debate. So instead you could have talked about 10 points if you just thought everything was contentious, but if you removed like half of them, now it's just down to 5, right? That's a much more simple argument to have, and a lot more headway can be made there. So you don't end up agreeing or end up discussing stuff you already agree on, which is mostly a waste of everyone's time. In addition to that, it allows both parties to reconfirm their views to avoid agreeing stuff that they agree on, or to avoid discussing stuff they agree on. So when you say, okay, we agree on this, we agree on that, we agree on that, they go, yep. Or they go, wait, no, I don't agree on that because you phrased that wrong. And then it can really, really solidify what you do agree on and really bring into the forefront what you don't agree on. Lastly, for the technical reasons, it can offer inroads into their reasoning and help you expand your view or better expose their flaws. So for example, if in the context of lifting for sports that we've been using throughout this lecture, if they say, I think too much lifting is a problem for fatigue, then you already know that if you couch your argument and say, look, as long as we don't get too fatiguing, is lifting probably okay? They'll probably very likely to agree with you. right? So as you find things you agree and disagree on, the entire argument starts to become much more clear and smaller in scope. Think of it as basically chipping away at the argument to find out exactly what it is we disagree on. The more we chip away, the easier our problem is at the end of it. We might not disagree on a whole lot, it turns out. Now, those are the technical reasons. The psychological reasons, and technical reasons are important, but the psychological reasons are probably even more important for why we try to establish common ground. Number one is you paint yourself as open and respectful. This increases the chance of any discussion being productive versus unproductive. Remember, we live in a free society. No individual has to argue with you about anything. And if they don't like the way you're coming at them, they're going to consider it a personal insult, or at the very least annoying. They're not going to want to engage you in discussion. People like to engage in discussion where they think they have something to benefit, or if it's pleasant, or they feel like you're on their side. If you're open and respectful, they'll feel mean turning you down. They'll be like, well, I really want to try to understand, and I think you make some good points. They'll go, oh, damn it. Well, here's what I think. But if you're like, I think you're an idiot, and I can't believe a human being would actually hold these positions, then they're like, well, you know what, you can go straight to hell, right? So number one is it paints you as open and respectful, which is really, really good. Now, number two, also super important. When you go through and agree with parts of the argument, at least see where they're coming from on others, and in between there kind of make some, I guess, meet them halfway and say, okay, that's a really good point at the very least. Maybe it's not completely true. They start to see you as a rational being. This gives you a couple of really big advantages. Number one, they think that you don't have a totally insane view of the issue or the landscape around it, right? If you're debating, let's say you're debating something super contentious, pro-life versus pro-choice. If you are pro-life, let's say, and you say to someone, I really see where you're coming from about abortion because, it's a woman's body and I do recognize the right to choose. Now, what you didn't say is that you think the right to choose isn't as important as the right that a fetus has to its life. I'm not here to take a position. I actually don't have a position on this issue, to be completely honest. But if you present yourself as someone who says, listen, I do think women's rights are important, and I don't think you're just trying to murder babies, then all of a sudden, the person who you're arguing with that is pro-choice, they go, okay, so this guy's pro-life or this girl's pro-life, but they're not totally insane. But if you're pro-life and you're like, any abortion is murder and it's baby killing and these people are all evil, they're going to think you're nuts and probably be correct. And even if you come from a really good place, that's just not going to show through, and they're really just not going to want to be interested in discussing it with you. Another thing, as you talk to them calmly about the parts of everything you agree with and see where it's coming from, they learn that you can be calmly reasoned with. So they go, okay, this person's calm, this person's reasonable, I can talk to them, and they're more likely to do so. If you're belligerent and yelling, most people just won't talk to you about it because they realize it's pointless. Another one, really big one. If you're very open and you say, now, you make some really good points here, it gives them the sensation, and it's a correct sensation, that you have the potential to change your mind. How many people would you ever debate if you knew for a fact that none of them would ever change their mind at all? I mean, what the fuck is the point of debating someone who will never change their mind? For your entertainment? That's an awfully boring way to entertain yourself, and it's actually just really annoying because nothing ever works. And maybe for the education of other onlookers, but man, the whole course here is arguing to convince. And if they think that you have the potential to change your mind, they're going to be 50,000 times more likely to try to change your mind by putting their best foot forward, as opposed to just not entering in a debate at all or just being really mean back to you. And, very importantly, as you invest time, your effort into trying to understand the arguments and categorizing them based on what you think about them, they realize, well, this person's investing quite a bit of time. That means maybe I'll invest my time. You're not a waste of time to them. For example, if you're debating a link dropper, right? You write these extensive arguments as to why you think your way is right, and all they do is they drop a link in the next comment section, no explanation, like, oh, a New York Times article about maybe tangentially related to this issue. And they don't even say, hey, here's a New York Times article maybe you should read. They just drop it. How much investment are they making into the argument? Basically none, like 3 seconds worth. How does that reflect on, the sort of equanimity, the justice of that debate? Not very. You feel like you're putting in all this work and they barely give a shit. Fuck them. You don't have to talk to them anymore. Why are you trying to convince them at all? That makes sense? So when someone really seems that not just seems, they really are invested in the discussion and really trying to understand your points and really trying to categorize them, that's a really good thing, because you're more likely on the opposing side to be like, well, you know what? Oh, geez, this person really wants to learn and they're really taking me seriously. Let's chat it out. And maybe I can learn something too. Really, really prepares them psychologically to themselves be all of those things, to be open, calm, and then you can really work to the truth of those kinds of mindsets as opposed to just being combative. More reasons in the psychological realm of why to establish common ground. Reason number 3, they get the feeling that you're largely on the same side and are interested in their views. This is very important to promoting discourse. I mean, if you're largely on the same side, it's a really different discussion than if you're largely opposed. Imagine World War II and you're having a debate about some kind of issue, just a political issue, with a person who has literally been by your side for the whole war. You're in the same fire team. You've taken bullets for them. They've taken bullets for you. They've covered you in combat. You're both fighting Nazis. Everyone's on the same team. You can have one hell of a heated debate with them and never cross the line or call them a piece of shit and just stop debating them and run away or say they're evil and they're not worth living, because you have so much in common with them. You basically feel like you're on the same team. You're going to be much more likely when they disagree with you to be like, hey, well, so, obviously we're friends. Obviously we're on the same side. What's going on? Tell me what's going on and maybe we'll come to an agreement. But if you're debating a member of the opposing army, geez, I mean, you're literally consider them evil, right? You don't even care what they say. So if you can when people and human beings enter debates, we're all genetically primed to enter debates as warriors in a confrontation. Good versus evil. If you can align yourself to be on the same side, almost, and just a little bit of difference, people just aren't as combative anymore. Remember, combativeness doesn't help debate at all. It hurts it in every single instance. So once they see that you're largely on the same side and that you're interested in their views, they're very likely to share their views and be very open-minded about what you have to say to them. Number 4 is kind of a result of all this. They enter the frame, kind of a psychological state of mind of let's work toward the truth together, and animosity and resistance towards logic declines considerably, right? If you're really just ready to work on something together, then there is no winner and loser. Actually, there is. The winners are both individuals that exchange information and get closer towards the truth, and the losers are the people that get too caught up in their egos and can't do that whole process and can't learn. Not winner person number 1, loser person number 2. And this is the thing we've been repeating over this entire course. Debate, there is no winner and loser in a debate. There are just two individuals looking for the truth. If you can put that person in that frame by doing all of these things, then they're going to be so much more likely to go towards the truth with you and actually accomplish a good discussion, versus if they think you just hate them or something like that, right? And lastly, point number 5 is that this establishing of common ground is as much for you as it is for them. We'd like to think that all of us that are in this, studying this course right now, that are listening to these presentations, we like to think that we're on the side of the angels. We like to think that we don't ever lose control. We like to think that we're always rational and always calm and always logical, and that we can always see the objective reality. But that's not true at all. All of us, at some point, myself many times, have gotten caught up in the emotionality of an argument, especially with issues that are close to home. For me, one of those issues, because I came from the former Soviet Union and communism ruined that whole country and worse, and killed millions of people, when I debate with socialists or communists, I have a real tendency that I have to resist to try to make them my enemies, and hatred bubbles up. But that's not going to accomplish much. So one of the reasons we establish common ground isn't just for the other person to become more open towards walking towards the truth. It's to open ourselves up as well. Once you look at someone's views and you pick out the views you agree with, pick out the views you see where they're coming from and the views which are actually pretty good points, you just lose a lot of your own animosity. You're like, man, this person's more or less on the right track. It's just a little bit that we differ. And that's really good, because once you have lost your animosity, theirs is going to be hard to maintain. One-sided animosity is tough. When one person's being super nice, super understanding, the other person starts to feel really bad if they're being really angry. But as soon as you get angry with them, they have every, not right, but every reflex to be angry with you. And that's when things get very unproductive. So, what is the course of action for establishing common ground? We know that there's 3 things to do, right? But the three things occur in a particular order because of one thing. We want to establish during this portion of discussion a cooperative momentum, which means we're going to address the stuff we have in common first before we argue about it. That's strange. We get over this big hump of stuff that we see where they're coming from, but we don't agree with them first. Then we get to stuff that we agree with them more, and we end this section of the argument on stuff we completely agree. By the way, preview, the next lecture will be on how to actually address the areas of disagreement. But if you started out with the areas of disagreement in the preparatory phase right now and ended on the areas of total agreement, how open are they to discussing disagreements? A ton. If we flipped it around the other way and we started with commonalities first and went to least commonalities, as we get into the debate, you're literally prepping that person to be more and more resistant. You're like, okay, this stuff we definitely agree on. They're like, cool. This stuff we don't really agree on, but you got some good points. They're like, okay, this stuff, I see where you're coming from, but I think it's wrong. They're like, all right, great, bring it on, because I think I'm completely right. And they're like, okay, time to argue. All the way around. When I flip that whole thing, get over the hump first of stuff, I see where you're coming from, and they're like, okay, let's get to debating. And you're like, now you make some really good points here. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. And plus all this other stuff we totally agree on. And they're like, oh, this is great. And you're like, all right, let's come back and talk about the contentious stuff. And all of a sudden they're like, okay, cool. The contentious stuff doesn't seem that bad, right? We want to sort of warm up in the way that cool down the debate before we get into it versus warm up into the debate. You don't want to do that part because it just makes people more and more angry and emotional, etc., right? And like we just said, it means addressing the disagreement first, then admitting the good points, and finally addressing the commonalities to set up the best possible momentum of agreement, to take that energy and that emotion of we're on the same side and bring it into the actual debate once we start talking about the real contentious issues, right? So, right, once you're over the hump of addressing disagreement for understood perspectives, the conversation content becomes more and more cooperative when we bring that momentum in, right? All right. Point number one, or procedure number one of understood perspectives, right? Understood perspectives is once you look over all of their points, it's reserved for the facets or points of their views that you most disagree with or have underlying logical inferences you find hardest to agree with. Now, a really good response to this is to say, I see where you're coming from. Notice, when you tell someone, I see where you're coming from, you are not agreeing with them at all. For example, someone punches somebody in the face because that person cut in line by accident because they just weren't looking at a grocery store. Do you agree that punching someone in the face is a good thing, is a just thing, is a proper thing because somebody cut in line by accident? No, you're an adult. You probably think tapping them on the shoulder and being like, hey, excuse me, I was standing here, or just even forgetting the whole thing is probably for the best. But can you see where someone's coming from? Have you ever been cut in front of, especially when you were in a rush or having a really bad day, and you just get this vitriolic anger? You're like, oh my God, if one more person cuts in front of me, I am going to blow up the whole fucking world I'm just going to turn into one big nuclear bomb and kill everyone. Of course, we've all been there, especially if a person's cutting you off in traffic in a vehicle. I mean, holy crap. So when someone says, I think it should be okay to punch people at the grocery store, and that's their argument, if they cut in front of the line, you go, okay, I totally see where you're coming from. I see where it comes from, right? That doesn't mean you agree with them. You don't. That's an insane idea. It just fights everywhere all the time. But you can understand that there are some emotions behind it, right? The good thing is that anytime someone offers a legitimate view that they have, it's at the very least backed by emotion, right? So I see where you're coming from is something you can say just to validate their emotion. I see that because you have this emotion, you want to do this. Now, that doesn't mean this emotion is even justified or rational, but you didn't get to that yet. But you do see where they're coming from, and you can use this on any variety of behaviors and every variety of behaviors. There's always a reason someone does something. This is simply acknowledging it. Psychologically, it's a great tool because people say, okay, well, he sees where I'm coming from, that's good. As opposed to being like, you're a completely insane person. Nobody should ever think like this. You're nuts. And then the debate is over because you're never going to, there's no surmounting that kind of level of ego disparity, right? What does this do? It recognizes their views. It legitimizes their views and their position. It humanizes their views, right? When you tell someone, hey, look, I feel you when you want to punch people in the face in the grocery store line when they cut, you're humanizing them. You go, look, I'm a human being too. Human beings get pissed. They no longer feel like, literally Hitler, right? Or like a terrorist or something, or like the world, like a psychopath. They feel just like a human being who's having a bad day. And that's totally cool. That's totally fine. And then you can talk about the details with them later, and they'll probably admit later, like, yeah, like, I don't actually think it's a good idea to punch people, but you know where I'm coming from. And you're like, totally, right? Totally. Right? So it might actually be like that. And if you don't see where they are coming from, ask, right? Let's say you're debating, this is a weird example. Let's say you're debating a member of ISIS. And they're like, I think that the West needs to be destroyed completely. You may have no idea where they're coming from. I sure as hell don't, right? But ask, right? And of course, if you can do this with an ISIS member, you do this with anybody. But you say, okay, so like, why exactly do you want to destroy the West? They say, well, our reading of the Quran says that the West is just sinful and needs to be destroyed via holy war. And you may disagree with the reading of the Quran, which is probably quite wrong if they've concluded that, but you understand that they read a book that is very sacred to them, and that sacred book, by the word of God, commanded them to do something. Can you understand why someone commanded by the word of God, even though if they misinterpreted the word of God, would do some horrible, heinous things? Well, yeah, it's God, right? So then, once they explain that, you go, okay, I see where you're coming from. And remember, do you agree with them? Hell no. When you walk out of the room, you call the CIA so they get sniped and shot right on sight because you think they're evil, but you see where they're coming from, right? And potentially, if you talk to someone with really extreme views, maybe not an ISIS member, you can actually make some headway, and you both leave the conversation being like, maybe my views shouldn't be as extreme as they are. They might prove themselves wrong during the discussion, right? So you can ask, if you don't know where someone's coming from, be like, well, so why do you think a paleo diet is a good idea? Or why do you think a high-carb diet is a good idea? Because you might not know where they're coming from. They'll tell you. Trust me, they'll explain it very well. People love to explain why they think certain things in almost every situation, right? It is largely psychological. The effect of this, it does create insights into their errors for your future debate points. So for example, if someone said, well, I like the high-carb diet because low-carb diets are really, really bad for your health. You say, oh, I see where you're coming from, right? Because it's easy to see, like, if someone thinks something's bad for your health, of course they won't eat it, right? So they'll stick to high-carb thinking low-carb is bad for health. Totally see where you're coming from. But for later parts of the debate, you're like, okay, I see where they're coming from. And already collecting research on the computer in the back, or if you're in a live debate, you're already noting what studies you want to cite or what body of literature you want to cite, and to refute the actual view that low-carb diets are bad for health. So you can be like, low-carb diet's actually not bad for health, and here's 5 meta-analyses. And when the time comes, not now, and you present those views in the debate, they go, wow, I had that wrong. And all of a sudden, you've taken away their big premise because they told you what their big premise was. All right. So examples of understood perspectives. Let's say someone says, the unsafe athlete opinion, right? Or unsafe weightlifting for athletes. So, okay, so do you think lifting weights is unsafe for athletes? And they say, it's heavyweight. Everyone gets hurt if they train like that and roll the dice. It's enough risk to be practicing already, right? So even practice is risk. Why risk it more with lifting weights is what they say. And you could say something like, well, I can see where you're coming from. Injuries can definitely happen in the weight room as well as on the field, and it's completely true. Right? And of course, later on, you'll point out how the net balance of injuries actually goes down with weight training, especially over the long term, but not yet. All you do is you recognize where they're coming from, even though it's wrong, right? You say, yeah, okay, I totally see where you're coming from. Nobody wants injuries. And all of a sudden, they're like, that person, yeah, see, they agree with me. They also think injuries are bad, and they very much do. But that builds the kind of commonality that later they won't take offense to you protesting that. They'll be like, okay, but you do agree injuries are bad. You're like, yep, but here's how the stuff really happens. And they're like, oh, okay, I see where you're coming from. And then all of a sudden, you agree on more than you disagree. Next category, more on the side of agreement, kind of in the middle, are good points, right? This type of recognition is reserved for the positions of theirs that you find potentially true or true with modification. Not just completely wrong, that's the understood perspective ones. And these are usually much more tenable than understood perspectives, right? It's a good idea when you order their views, when you talk about the good points, it's a good idea to think, so I really think something, you want to say something like, I really think it makes some good points here with, the fact that, injuries can happen in the weight room or something like that. Or the fact that athletes have more time to practice if they don't lift weights like that. That is a good point. Think about it. All the stuff you know about maximum recoverable volume and total recovery ability, whatever. Is it a good point that if athletes don't train with weights, they have more time to invest in their sport? Of course. And the more they invest in the sport, the better they get. Now, it turns out weight training carves its own very good niche there and actually is worth very much that time. But it's a pretty good point to say, hey, look, the more our guys train weights, the less they can train in the sport. That's a really good point. I mean, that's a point you would make, right? So it's not completely correct, but it's got a lot of truth to it. And it really greatly eases the animosity, the chances for recalcitrance, right? Which is just like holding your views super close and not letting them go. And here's the deal. No one on the other team, the other side, the opposing views would ever admit that they have good points. How many times have you guys ever seen a political debate, which unfortunately those debates are not for anyone's learning benefit, they're simply to win rhetorically for the crowd, which means they suck. How many times have you seen a politician tell another politician in a formal debate on TV, now look, I think you actually make some really good points? I mean, that'd be suicide because a lot of people say, well, geez, if that person's making good points, why are you running against them, right? But if we're all running together for the same truth, then that's a really great admission, right? So people usually see debates on the internet or in person that are learning discussions for you. We're all wired to see them as kind of like political debates. You admit nothing is wrong with your side and everything's wrong with the other person's side. And people are waiting for that kind of animosity. They're ready to fight you. And when you say, hey, look, you got some really good points here, they take their fists and they're like, what did you say? And you're like, points like 3, 4, and 5 are like really good. There's a lot of truth to that. And they're like, well, clearly this person's not my enemy. They can't be my enemy because they're admitting that I'm right on some stuff. All of a sudden, they relax, things get calmer, and the spirit of cooperation is on the rise. It's tough to hate people that admit you're right in large part, and very few people can pull that off. So what are some examples, right? So they say, back to our sport example, there are certain techniques you have to learn to lift safely, and too many coaches can't teach them right. That's what they say. That's why they're against lifting weights, because most coaches don't know how to teach athletes to lift weights safely. And you say, that's a really great point. Lifting with bad technique via incompetent coaching is a very real downside and a very serious concern. And they go, oh, yeah, sweet. They agree with me. And you do, right? Now, remember that you still have a little bit of an ace up your sleeve for later. You're not arguing for lifting of any kind, because there's a lot of dangerous lifting that's stupid that you would never argue for. You're arguing only for proper lifting. So you really are with them here. So when they say, I'm against lifting because most coaches or some some fraction of coaches can't teach the lift properly, you agree with them 100% that that's the case. And you say, now, so if we have a good coach, though, we should be lifting because it has advantages. And they go, yeah, I guess, but those are so hard to find. And you go, yeah, they sure are. And then you're done arguing. Right? Everyone agrees there are bad coaches out there. You can talk about what the fraction is later. That's another debate. But if you agree that lifting should be done with good technique, there's no, discussion there. And if they think about your argument and the debate when they leave and they go talk to other people, maybe they're a strength coach, maybe they're, a sport coach, maybe they're an athletic director. When someone's like, so I hear you're against lifting weights. Is that true? Because I'm against it too. They say, yeah, they remember your debate. And they go, yeah, I'm not against lifting weights. I'm not. Whereas 2 weeks before, they'd be like, oh, absolutely, I'm against lifting weights. They say, yeah, I'm not really against lifting weights. I just think it should be done safely, and there's so few coaches that teach it. And then that other person talking to them be like, oh, I totally agree. There's like a USA weightlifting certification course for coaches that we can make all of our strength coaches take. And once they pass, that means our athletes are being trained safely, probably. And that same athletic director who was against weights merely 2 weeks ago can go, that sounds like a great idea. They get all their athletes or all their weight training coaches to pass that USAW certification test. And then shortly, after a couple of weeks of passing the test, they're good to go. And that athletic director, next time they get asked, so are you against lifting weights? Like, no, absolutely not. But I am a stickler for safety, and I think coaches should be certified. That's what they always thought. They just shortcutted it to just assuming that coaches weren't capable of doing so. But once they found a way to make them capable, boom. It was your argument that lowered their resistance and made them open to that possibility to begin with. That's the true way to win an argument, to bring everyone better results. Right? Lastly, after you point out their good points, and of course you've pointed out areas where you understand where they're coming from, you want to point out actual commonalities, things where you agree. So you can view knowledge as an iceberg. There's a huge submerged part, okay? And there's a tip sticking out of the water. When we are talking with someone, the tip of the iceberg is the stuff we disagree on, right? That's the understood perspective, the stuff you're just not going to agree on, right? Your idea, your iceberg, or your idea of the shape of that tip is different than theirs. So you say, okay, I see that you see the tip of the iceberg looks like this. The good points are kind of the water line, right? So there's the tip, here's the water. This area in the water line is kind of like 50-50. Like there's some good points here, because some of it includes the submerged stuff we agree on, but some of this tip stuff, maybe it's not exactly 100% true. The thing is, the submerged part is, sort of metaphor to the stuff you agree on, and it's massive. So after you get through talking about the tip of the iceberg, being like, okay, so I see where you're coming from, and then the waterline being like, oh, some really good points, then you remind them of this huge submerged area of agreement, right? And usually there is a lot of pertinent info or views to agree with, right? Fundamentally, most people agree about much more than they disagree. I'll use a political example because this is very true in politics. Here's the deal. If you talk to someone about politics, a really great way to generate this pointing out commonalities is, okay, we both want like peace and prosperity, right? I mean, there are very few political parties or political views, let's say in the United States or Western Europe or Asia, which are not for prosperity and not for peace. I mean, yeah, North Korea might be not for either one of those, but in a rhetorical debate, even they might say they're for prosperity and peace. They're just going about it all wrong. So after because in a debate, especially about politics, people, like we've mentioned before, tend to caricature each other as just totally vile and evil and just completely inappropriate, situations and give their opponents politically just these crazy intentions. Well, my political opponent wants to destroy this country. Like, really? I mean, they should probably just have a different opinion about how the country could get better. It may be a very wrong opinion, but nonetheless, they want the same fundamental things, and that's a huge commonality. More close to our fields here in sport and exercise science, everyone wants better quality food. So if you're debating with someone about like food regulatory standards or how if it fits your macros, how is junk food compared to like more natural or whole food? I mean, everyone wants health. Everyone wants good food. We just have different ideas of what that means. Athlete safety. I mean, there's not really anyone arguing against keeping athletes as safe as possible. In the sport world, victory. Everyone wants athletes on their team to win games. So when you say, hey, look, fundamentally, we're trying to keep athletes safe and we're trying to get athletes to win games, right? And nobody's going to disagree with that. They go, totally. And if you end on that note before getting into disagreements, you seem like you're really much on the same side, and you really are. That's the truth of the matter. Right? So if you get into this idea that you scope out the argument and it turns out there are very few commonalities, you can try to expand the landscape or kind of just see more of the iceberg submerged than you usually would just to get some commonalities going. You can't do it in an absurd way. So you can't, let's say the aliens are coming to destroy Earth. You can't be like, hey, now, we're both alive, so we both like life, right? I mean, yeah, but that's Jesus. Every life likes life, but they just happen to hate you, right? So maybe you can do a realistic commonality of like, well, no, so we both like trade and we both like wealth. If you don't blow up our planet, we can trade valuable resources. You guys can have a spaceport on our planet and everyone wins. And they go, actually, it's true. We do like trade. It's expensive for us to fight wars. If you guys aren't going to attack us, we don't really care about you, especially if we get to park our spaceships on your planet. Oh, it's all good to go, right? And you normally wouldn't have said that, but you expand the circle of agreement to include that stuff. If you're talking about different kinds of diets for health, and it seems obvious to both of you that you both want health, sometimes it's a good idea to state that because it gives you kind of like this egress ability, this ability to return to what's agreed upon and then later come back to what's not agreed upon, right? Every now and again, you get overheated and you're like, well, the low carb diet's super great. And they're like, no, the high carb diet's super great. Sometimes you can recess and go, okay, now we both want health, right? And they go, yes. And then you go, okay, great. So we're both on the same side. And then you go back into contentious issues. Much better, builds a much better psychological base for being like, okay, when they talk to you and when you argue with them and they with you, at least no one's in the position that, okay, this person just doesn't care about health and is an idiot, right? Clearly, they both care about health, and let's find out what everyone has to say for everyone to be healthy. Much, much better on. It's tempting to skimp on this step. Sometimes it seems like you're just making yourself extra work. Like, of course, we're going to agree on what we agree on, but I want to get to the issue of what we're not going to agree on. bad idea. Because remember, over-focusing on the disagreement causes an increase in animosity and recalcitrance and egoism, and then it makes this huge skyscraper for you to topple to get to the actual truth. You want to lower all those feelings by agreeing not as much as possible, because like we both think the sun rises and falls, right? Like we both think the universe exists. Like that just starts to get pedantic and ridiculous. It just seems like you're trying to buddy up with them and just agree on stuff like, come on, we're on the same team, right? Like, things are good, life is good, we both like life. Like, you don't have to do that in a nutritional debate, but you should come down at least one level to the obvious commonalities and list those out, because that does actually build a sense of community, a sense of togetherness, and then we can enter into a discussion much more effectively after that. Don't skimp out on it, because all you're going to have is the stuff you disagree on. That's not really a good way to start an argument, because again, it builds resistance, right? What's an example of pointing out commonalities, right? So, quote, ready? This is you arguing for weights to be included in sport training, talking about commonalities. He goes, okay, to the sport coach that's against them, let's say. You say, I think we both understand that winning games and being safe are top priorities. We don't want to put athletes through any kind of training that messes with either of those. And whatever training we do recommend, it had better increase his chance of winning, make athletes safer, or some measure of both. Nobody in the sport world is going to disagree with that. Once you say that, they're going to be like, yeah, totally. And now you've built a ton of common ground, and now you're ready to address disagreements in a productive, cooperative manner. Addressing the actual disagreement is what the next lecture is about. I'll leave you guys till then, and just remember, why did we have to talk so much about building this underlying architecture in which to actually start the discussion of the disagreement? Because both from a technical perspective of seeing each other's side, and much more importantly, the psychological perspective, that base is what's going to allow us to accomplish an agreement. If we never built the base, we're basically starting off at total war, and that goes very, very poorly very often. We'll talk about the actual disagreement next time. Thanks so much for tuning in.